A tragic story about the old man and the snakes.
Hello everyone, enjoy these relaxing moments while you watch.
A thick fog enveloped the small village in Sierra Verde. The village, with its red-tiled roofs nestled among the deep green hills, harbored mysterious tales that the villagers often shared around the fireplace. Among those stories, none stood out more than the name Samuel, whom they called by the nickname El Viejo de las Serpientes, the Old Man of the Snakes. Samuel lived alone in an old wooden house at the foot of the hill, where he spent his life raising and protecting rare snakes. No one knew the true origin of these snakes, but Samuel always treated them like family. The brightly colored snakes with their strange, intricate patterns were often seen coiled around him when he walked near his farm. "He's so peculiar," Rose, a middle-aged woman who ran a small grocery store in the village, whispered to her regular customers. "It's almost like he can talk to the snakes. Who knows if he's dabbling in witchcraft or something?" "That's right," agreed Matthew, an elderly blacksmith, nodding solemnly. "I heard his wife died when he was young. Since then, he hasn't interacted with anyone, just living with those snakes." Rumors like these spread throughout the village, creating a shroud of mystery around Samuel. But to him, the snakes were everything. They were symbols of the love and connection he still felt for his late wife. Once, he told a curious boy named Michael that each snake carried a fragment of his wife's soul. "Don't believe me?" Samuel said, his voice deep and mesmerizing. "They are my friends, my protectors. They would never harm anyone unless threatened." Michael, just 10 years old, didn't know how to respond. He merely stared at Samuel with a mix of curiosity and fear, captivated by the man's commanding presence. However, not everyone stopped at mere curiosity. Stephen, a young and ambitious merchant with cunning plans, saw immense commercial potential in Samuel's snakes. He often visited the village to trade, but his sharp eyes frequently lingered on Samuel's farm, drawn by what he coveted. One afternoon, Stephen sat in the village tavern with a few locals, initiating a conversation with a calculating expression. "Do you know how valuable those snakes are?" he began, his voice low and deliberate to capture attention. "Their skins can be used to make luxury goods. Their venom can be sold to laboratories for outrageous sums." "But Samuel would never sell them," Rose interrupted. "He treats them like family." "Family?" Stephen scoffed dismissively. "A bunch of snakes. He's just an eccentric old man. We should be careful because who knows what he's really doing with them." Stephen's words were like a spark igniting the smoldering fears among the villagers. Some began whispering, recounting old stories of seeing Samuel walking through the village with snakes coiled around him. "We should do something," said a young man named Nathan, his face tense. "What if he really is dangerous?" Stephen smiled to himself. His plan was beginning to take shape. He knew that by sowing enough fear and suspicion, Samuel would become isolated, and the farm with its precious snakes would be his for the taking. Meanwhile, Samuel continued to live peacefully in his own world, unaware of the brewing undercurrents in the village. He spent his time caring for the snakes, speaking to them as if they understood every word. The snakes, in turn, seemed to share a strange connection with him, responding subtly to his voice and movements. "Tomorrow will be a beautiful day, I can feel it," Samuel whispered to a snake with shimmering emerald green scales coiled around his arm. "We'll go see the wildflowers at the foot of the hill." But Samuel didn't know that tomorrow would not be a beautiful day. The dark clouds of conspiracy and betrayal were beginning to loom over the village, and Samuel, along with his silent companions, would face an unprecedented challenge. The crimson glow of the setting sun bathed the cobblestone path leading into the village. In the small tavern at its center, Stephen lounged in a wooden chair, his finger idly tracing the rim of his wine glass. His face was cold, and his dark eyes gleamed with calculation. Stephen was a merchant, but not the respectable kind. He thrived on exploitation, deceit, and manipulation to achieve his goals. Listen, Rose, Stephen said, his voice sweet but laced with insincerity. Do you think it's safe to let a strange old man like Samuel live among us? I've heard those snakes, they bring bad luck. Rose hesitated, glancing at Nathan, who stood nearby with a worried expression. Samuel has never harmed anyone, she countered. He just wants to live in peace. Stephen smirked, narrowing his eyes at Rose. You're too kind-hearted, Rose. But think about the children in this village. What if one of them gets bitten by a snake? Who would take responsibility? Samuel? Or us? His words gave Rose pause. Nathan, a young man prone to impulsiveness, furrowed his brow. It's not entirely unreasonable, he muttered. Those snakes, who knows what harm they could cause? Seizing the opportunity, Stephen continued to stoke their fears. Exactly, Nathan. And think about their value. Those rare snakes could benefit the whole village if they were in the hands of someone who knew how to make use of them. Stephen's words began to spark agreement in some, though others remained silent, neither supporting nor opposing him. Rose held firm to her stance, but unease crept into her thoughts as she witnessed Stephen's manipulative skill. Come on, Stephen, Rose said, trying to stay composed. This village thrives on harmony. Don't stir up trouble over baseless rumors. Stephen shrugged, feigning innocence. I only want what's best for everyone, Rose. But I won't force anyone. Each person should decide for themselves what's right. As night fell, Stephen left the tavern, leaving behind a heavy atmosphere. Nathan watched him go, torn between the allure of Stephen's words and an underlying sense that something wasn't right. Meanwhile, Stephen slowly made his way toward Samuel's farm. He couldn't stop thinking about the snakes and their value. If he could seize them, he wouldn't just become wealthy, he would hold a power that no one could challenge. Approaching the farm, Stephen stopped behind a dense bush to observe. The faint light from Samuel's house illuminated the old man tending to his snakes. Ridiculous, Stephen muttered. He spent his whole life on these creatures. They should be mine. He stood there for a while, watching Samuel through the rotting wooden fence. The snakes seemed to be at rest, but Stephen couldn't shake the eerie feeling they were aware of his presence. Something about the way they moved unsettled him, as if they knew he was there. Humph, I'll be back, Stephen muttered, his eyes flashing with malice. And next time, no one will stop me. The next morning, rumors about the danger of the snakes began spreading throughout the village. Those who had once been hesitant to side with Stephen now started looking at Samuel with suspicion. Villagers gathered outside Rose's store to discuss the situation. We can't let him continue like this, Nathan said, his voice full of agitation. What if a child gets bitten? We have to do something before it's too late. But Samuel has never hurt anyone, Rose reiterated, though her voice was weaker this time, her confidence seeming to falter. Are we really going to let rumors dictate our actions? This isn't just a rumor, Rose, Stephen interrupted, stepping in with a grave expression. I saw those snakes with my own eyes. They're massive, aggressive, and completely uncontrollable. Stephen's words were like fuel to the fire, amplifying the villagers' worries. Some began suggesting that Samuel should be asked to leave the village or dismantle his farm. That evening, while Samuel was reading by the light of an oil lamp, he heard footsteps near the fence. He looked up, his sharp eyes scanning the darkness. Who's there? He called out, his voice low but commanding. There was no reply, only the sound of dry grass being trampled underfoot. Samuel set his book down, rose to his feet and stepped outside. If someone is here to do wrong, I suggest you stop, he said, his voice filled with authority. In the shadows, Stephen backed away, but he didn't leave. Instead, he smirked. Just wait, old man, he whispered. Next time, you won't catch me so easily. The pale moonlight bathed the hills, creating an eerie atmosphere. Samuel sat in his small wooden house, quietly listening to the soft rustle of snakes moving across the floor. To him, it was a familiar sound, like a lullaby easing him into sleep. But tonight, the peace was shattered by a strange noise outside. Crack, crack. The sound of a branch breaking echoed through the darkness, close to the snake enclosures. Samuel immediately put down his book, stood up, and grabbed his oil lamp. His eyes glinted with alertness. "Who's there?" Samuel called, but only the cold wind answered him. He stepped outside, his long coat billowing in the night breeze. Sweeping the lamp's light across the yard, he noticed the door to the snake enclosure was slightly ajar, something that should have been impossible, as he always double-checked it before resting. Samuel moved closer and saw footprints pressed into the damp soil. "Who dares trespass here?" he muttered, anger rising in his voice. Meanwhile, Stephen crouched in a hidden corner, his eyes fixed on a coiled snake inside the enclosure. He had planned carefully, bringing a large cloth bag to capture the rare snakes. But as he reached toward one of them, a sharp hissing sound rang out, startling him. "Don't be foolish, Stephen," Samuel's voice cut through the night, cold and authoritative. "These snakes are not for the greedy like you." Stephen turned around, trying to hide the cloth bag behind his back. "Old man, I was just curious," he said, feigning nonchalance. "I've heard so much about them, so I wanted to see them up close." Samuel stepped closer, his piercing gaze seeming to see straight through him. "Curious? Or were you planning to steal them?" He stared at Stephen intently, forcing him to step back. "You're talking nonsense," Stephen scoffed, though his eyes betrayed his unease. "I had no intention of harming anyone." Samuel smirked. "I know you, Stephen. You never do anything without expecting something in return. But listen closely, these snakes are not mere animals. They are my family. If you harm them, the consequences will be unimaginable." Stephen frowned, trying to mask his confusion. "Family? You're talking about these snakes as if they're people. How ridiculous." "You don't understand, and you don't need to," Samuel replied, his tone turning icy. "But I warn you, Stephen. Don't ever come back here." Stephen laughed loudly, but his laughter couldn't hide the bitterness in his eyes. "A warning? You're just a lonely old man. Do you think you can protect these snakes forever? One day, they'll be mine." Samuel didn't respond. He stood motionless, like a statue, his eyes fixed on Stephen until he disappeared into the night. The next morning, Stephen showed up at the tavern, his face full of anger. He recounted his encounter with Samuel to Rose and Nathan, but he twisted the story entirely. "He threatened me," Stephen said dramatically. "He said if I came back, those snakes would attack me. Don't you see how dangerous he is?" "Dangerous?" Rose frowned. "Samuel is just an old man. I've never heard of him harming anyone." "That's because he's good at hiding it," Stephen said, his eyes flashing with malice. "I've seen how he controls those snakes. They obey him like loyal dogs. Who knows what he's done to make them that way?" Nathan nodded, captivated by Stephen's story. "We can't ignore this. If he really can control snakes, that's a serious threat." Rose hesitated. "But what if we're wrong? If we accuse him unfairly? Samuel will never forgive us." "Forgive us?" Stephen sneered. "He has no one to forgive or not forgive. Have you forgotten he's just an old man living with snakes? We need to act before someone gets hurt." The conversation caught the attention of others in the tavern. Slowly, Stephen's words began to spread, planting seeds of fear in the villagers' hearts. That night, Samuel sat in his wooden house, his heart heavy with worry. He knew Stephen wouldn't give up easily. And just as he had feared, a few hours later, he heard noises outside once again. "What do you want this time, Stephen?" Samuel called, stepping outside with his oil lamp. But instead of answering, Stephen slipped through the back gate, trying to get closer to the snake enclosures. However, the snakes seemed to sense the intruder's presence. They slithered and hissed menacingly. A large black snake moved towards Stephen, forcing him to step back. "Get out of here now!" Samuel shouted, his eyes blazing with anger. He advanced towards Stephen, holding a wooden staff to drive him away. Stephen, though shaken, tried to keep his composure. "You'll regret this, old man. I won't give up." He retreated, but in his mind, he had already made a decision. He wouldn't simply sneak in again. He needed a bigger plan, a plan to destroy Samuel and take what he wanted. The next morning, a somber atmosphere blanketed the village. Stephen, with his hand wrapped in white bandages, appeared in the village square, his face twisted as if in severe pain. His cries for help echoed loudly, drawing the attention of everyone around. "My God, what happened, Stephen?" Rose exclaimed, rushing over in alarm. "Samuel!" Stephen roared, deliberately making his voice sound anguished. "I was bitten by one of the snakes from his enclosure last night. I nearly lost my life." The surrounding villagers erupted in murmurs. Nathan, the young blacksmith, stepped forward with a grave expression. "Are you saying Samuel let his snakes attack you?" "No, but he has no control over them." Stephen shouted, his eyes filled with feigned terror. "I was just passing by his farm when a large black snake lunged at me and bit me. If it weren't for the doctor in town, I'd be dead by now." Stephen's words were like a spark igniting a wildfire in the hearts of the villagers. Fear spread quickly, like an epidemic, and all eyes turned toward Samuel's farm. Rose tried to remain calm. "But Samuel has always said his snakes never leave their enclosure unless provoked. Are you sure you didn't do something to antagonize them?" Stephen reacted immediately. "I didn't do anything. It's because he keeps those venomous snakes that this entire village is in danger. If we don't act, someone will die." Nathan clenched his fists, his expression growing serious. "We have to do something. We can't let Samuel continue like this. If he doesn't get rid of the snakes, this won't stop here." Rose, though still skeptical, felt the pressure of the crowd mounting around her. The villagers began gathering outside her store, debating heatedly. Some, particularly the younger ones, seemed to side with Stephen. "Samuel isn't a bad person," said an elderly man, Don Raphael, his voice rising above the commotion. "He's lived peacefully until now. Don't let rumors drive us to lose our sense of reason." Stephen turned to Don Raphael, a cold smile spreading across his face. "Reason? If you don't believe me, look at the proof on my hand. The bite mark is still there." Don Raphael, his face thoughtful, stepped closer to Stephen to examine the white bandage wrapped around his hand. "So, you've had a doctor check this wound?" "Of course." Stephen replied, though his eyes flickered slightly, as if concealing something. "I have no reason to lie." Meanwhile, Samuel was at work on his farm, completely unaware of the turmoil brewing in the village. He tended to the snakes, gently running his hands over their smooth, glossy scales. "Today, we'll do a health check," Samuel said in his deep, soothing voice. "We won't let anyone harm each other, will we?" The snake seemed to respond to his words, slithering softly around his hands as if to answer. To Samuel, they weren't just creatures but family, the only living reminder of his late wife. But this peace was soon shattered as Nathan and a group of villagers appeared at the farm gate, armed with sticks and burning anger in their eyes. "Samuel!" Nathan shouted. "Come out here immediately." Samuel stepped out, holding his oil lamp. He looked calmly at the crowd before him, though his eyes betrayed a hint of surprise. "What's the matter, Nathan? Why are you all here?" Nathan took a step forward, pointing an accusatory finger at Samuel. "Stephen was bitten by one of your snakes last night. What do you have to say about that?" Samuel frowned. My snakes never leave their enclosures on their own. They don't harm anyone unless provoked. Stephen pushed forward, his face twisted as if in unbearable pain. You're lying. I was just passing by, and a snake lunged at me and bit me. Do you think you can keep hiding the danger you're putting us all in? Samuel looked directly into Stephen's eyes, his voice lowering. You're the one lying, Stephen. What did you do to provoke them? Samuel's words caused murmurs to ripple through the crowd. Some people began to hesitate, but Nathan, fueled by Stephen's agitation, kept up the pressure. This village has put up with enough, Samuel. If you don't release the snakes, we'll take matters into our own hands. Samuel clenched his fists, but his voice remained steady. These snakes are not your enemies. They only want to live in peace, just like I do. But if you've come here to destroy, you'll face the consequences of your actions. Is that a threat? Stephen shouted, deliberately fanning the flames of anger in the crowd. He's threatening all of us. The crowd began shouting, some even raising their sticks as if to break into the farm. Samuel stood firmly in front of the gate, unmoving. I don't want violence, Samuel said, his voice deep and resolute. But if you trespass here, you will face the consequences of your own choices. Stephen stepped closer, smirking coldly. You won't win this, Samuel. The villagers have made their choice. Your time is over. That night, the sky was moonless, with heavy black clouds hanging low, obscuring even the faintest stars. The air in the village of Sierra Verde was more oppressive than ever. Samuel sat in his small wooden house, the flickering oil lamp casting shadows on his weathered face, which looked more tired than usual. He knew that after the day's events, Stephen wouldn't give up so easily. Samuel slowly stepped outside, his eyes scanning the snake enclosures. He checked every door carefully, making sure they were securely locked. The snakes lay still inside, their bodies coiled, seemingly attuned to the tense atmosphere. We've lived peacefully for so many years, Samuel murmured, his deep voice barely audible. But now, those outsiders won't let us be. Soft hissing sounds came from the enclosures, almost as if the snakes were replying. Samuel looked at them, his heart heavy with worry. He wasn't only concerned for himself but also for the creatures he considered family. At the same time, on the other side of the village, Stephen was meeting with a group of people in the shadows. Nathan stood beside him, his face full of hesitation. Despite being riled up by Stephen all day, Nathan still felt deep down that what they were doing was wrong. Do we really have to do this? Nathan asked, his voice trembling. Stephen turned to him, his eyes gleaming dangerously. Listen, Nathan. If we don't act, this village will never be safe. Samuel and his snakes are a threat. If he won't leave, we'll make him. But setting fire. That's going too far. Nathan protested, but his voice weakened as he met Stephen's intimidating glare. You want to protect that old man? Stephen sneered, a derisive smirk curling on his lips. Remember, this is for the safety of the village. If you won't help, you'd best stay out of my way. Nathan remained silent, torn between his fear of Stephen and his guilt. He watched as Stephen signaled the others to prepare oil and torches. Around midnight, Samuel was abruptly awakened by the acrid smell of smoke. He bolted upright, his senses immediately alert. An orange glow flickered through the window, accompanied by the crackling sound of fire. Fire! Samuel shouted, rushing outside. Before him, the snake enclosure was engulfed in flames. The fire licked at the dry wooden roof, sending plumes of thick black smoke billowing into the sky. Samuel ran toward the enclosure, heedless of the heat and danger. No, he cried out, his trembling hands fumbling to open the doors. The snakes, sensing the imminent threat, began slithering out, weaving around his feet in search of safety. Some snakes made their way toward the village, seeking refuge, but as soon as they appeared, the villagers erupted in panic. A few wielded sticks to drive them away, while others fled in terror. "Drive them out. Don't let them into the village," someone shouted, swinging a stick down hard onto the ground. Meanwhile, Samuel continued his desperate efforts to save the remaining snakes. The fire spread rapidly, consuming the adjacent enclosures. The intense heat reddened his face, and sweat poured down his brow, but he refused to stop. "Go! Get out of here!" Samuel shouted, pushing the last snake out of the enclosure. "Live free!" Just as he was about to escape, a burning beam crashed down, blocking his path. Samuel collapsed to the ground, his eyes filled with despair. He watched the snake slither away into the distance, feeling a faint sense of relief that at least they had been saved. Outside, the villagers worked to extinguish the fire with large buckets of water. When the flames finally died down, all that remained was a pile of ash and rubble. Samuel lay motionless in the wreckage, his body scorched, his hands still clutching a small, lifeless snake. From a distance, Stephen observed the scene, struggling to conceal a satisfied smirk. He stepped forward, feigning grief. "We were too late," he said, his voice heavy with false sorrow. "I tried to warn him, but he wouldn't listen." Rose, standing nearby, had tears streaming down her face. "Samuel died protecting his snakes. Did we make a terrible mistake by pushing him to this?" Nathan stood in silence, his eyes full of regret as he gazed at Samuel's lifeless body. He knew things had gone too far, and he was complicit. But when he turned to look at Stephen, who was already manipulating the crowd with his lies, a quiet rage began to simmer within him. "You're despicable," Nathan muttered under his breath, too softly for Stephen to hear. The following day, the villagers gathered in the square to discuss the fate of the surviving snakes. Stephen stood in the center, wearing an exaggerated expression of sorrow. His hand was still wrapped in its white bandage, but upon closer inspection, one might notice that the wounds were not as severe as he had described. He waited until the square was full, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd like a hawk searching for prey. "I don't want to say this," Stephen began, his voice heavy as though burdened by the weight of the world. "But everyone here knows I was bitten by one of Samuel's snakes. That wasn't my fault. I was merely passing by his farm, and it happened." "But Samuel's snakes have never attacked anyone before," Rose interjected, standing across from Stephen, her eyes filled with suspicion. Stephen sighed dramatically, touching his bandaged hand as if to emphasize his pain. "Rose, I know you always try to see the best in people, but sometimes that kindness blinds you. I'm not lying. Samuel's snakes aren't just dangerous, they're uncontrollable. Think about it, what if it hadn't been me yesterday but a child from the village?" His words sparked murmurs among the villagers. Some nodded in agreement, while others exchanged worried glances. Rose, though resolute, felt the weight of the crowd's judgment pressing down on her. "Samuel is gone," Stephen continued, lowering his voice in a theatrical display of grief. "I didn't want this to happen. But now, those snakes are loose, slithering around the village and endangering us all. If we don't act, we'll be living in fear forever." "What do you mean by act?" Nathan asked, his voice tinged with confusion and unease. "What are you proposing, Stephen?" Stephen scanned the crowd, choosing his words carefully. "I don't want to cause any more harm. But we must face reality. Those snakes are valuable. If we leave them in the wild, they'll become a threat. But if used properly, they could bring great benefit to this village." "What benefit?" Rose demanded, her eyes narrowing. "They're not commodities to be sold, Stephen. They were Samuel's family." "Family?" Stephen let out a cold laugh that sent a chill down Rose's spine. "Don't be naive, Rose. He's dead. What family? Those snakes are nothing more than untapped resources. I know merchants who would pay a fortune for them. They could use the snakeskins for luxury goods or extract venom for medical research. With the money, we could rebuild this village and create a better life for everyone. Rose stepped forward angrily, pointing her finger at Stephen. You're exploiting Samuel's death for your own gain. You have no right to those snakes. Unfazed, Stephen shrugged, looking at Rose with disdain. Do you think I want this? I'm only trying to think of what's best for the village. If you have a better idea for keeping everyone safe, let's hear it. But don't forget, if we do nothing, those snakes will come back and harm us. Stephen's words continued to stoke fear among the villagers. Nathan, still haunted by guilt over the previous night, tried to speak up. But if we handle this the wrong way, we'll betray Samuel's memory. He died protecting those snakes. Stephen turned to Nathan, his gaze icy. And do you want the entire village to die with him? Don't be naive, Nathan. Samuel is the past. We have to think about the future. Do you want this village to remain paralyzed by fear, or do you want us to live in safety and prosperity? Nathan fell silent, the pressure from the crowd rendering him speechless. Some villagers, particularly the younger ones, began voicing support for Stephen. He's right, said a young man named John. We can't let those snakes roam free. If they're truly valuable, why not use them to improve our lives? Rose turned to John, her face filled with disappointment. You're willing to sell the village's soul for a few coins? Samuel dedicated his life to protecting those snakes. They're not meant to be sold. Stephen cut in, his voice commanding. Samuel is gone, Rose. Stop clinging to what no longer exists. I'm done arguing. We need to act now, before anyone else gets hurt. The villagers began to split into two factions. One side supported Stephen, believing he was trying to protect the village. The other, led by Rose and Don Raphael, sought to preserve Samuel's legacy and protect the snakes. But Stephen didn't stop there. He stepped forward, raising his hand as if to end the argument. Let me say this, if no one else wants to act, I'll do it myself. I'll contact the merchants I know. I'll make sure this village is safe, and we'll have the money to improve our lives. The crowd grew louder, fiery debates breaking out across the square. Rose watched Stephen, her heart full of anger but unsure how to stop him. He had planted too much fear and greed in the villagers' hearts. As night fell, Stephen left the square with a satisfied smirk. He knew he had won, at least for now. The village was divided, and this chaos would only make it easier for him to achieve his goals. Just wait, Samuel, Stephen muttered as he passed the charred remains of the farm. Even in death, I'll take what's rightfully mine. Under the pale morning sun, Rose stood silently on her porch, gazing toward the village square. She felt helpless to change the situation, but a voice behind her startled her. Rose, I need to talk to you, said a middle-aged man with a serious expression but bright, determined eyes. It was Mateo, a hunter who lived on the outskirts of the village. Mateo was known for his integrity and bravery but rarely involved himself in the village's disputes. Today, his presence carried an unusual weight. Mateo? What's going on? Rose asked, her voice tinged with curiosity. Mateo stepped closer, speaking in a low but firm tone. I know Stephen is lying. I examined his wound while he was asleep at the tavern last night. That's not a snake bite, Rose. It's a scratch he made himself. I found a small knife with blood on it in his pocket. Rose's eyes widened, half in shock and half in anger. Are you sure? If you're right, then Stephen has deceived the entire village. I'm certain, Mateo nodded, his eyes burning with resolve. I can't stand by and watch him exploit Samuel's death for his own gain. He's not just destroying Samuel's memory but dragging the entire village into chaos. What do we do? Rose asked, her hands clenching tightly, a mix of hope and worry in her voice. Mateo paused, thinking for a moment before answering. I'll tell the truth to the villagers. But I need your support, Rose. If I stand alone, they won't believe me. Rose nodded firmly. I'll stand with you. Samuel doesn't deserve this, and neither do the snakes. That afternoon, the village square was more crowded than ever. The villagers had gathered at Mateo's invitation, drawn by his announcement of an important revelation. Stephen was also present, standing off to one side with a displeased expression. He didn't like attention being diverted from his plans. Mateo stepped into the center of the crowd, raising his hand to call for silence. Everyone, I have a truth to reveal, he began, his deep, steady voice commanding attention. I know that we've been divided by fear and greed, but I can't remain silent when I know the truth is being twisted. Mateo, what are you talking about? Nathan asked, his face a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Mateo turned to Nathan, then fixed his gaze on Stephen. I've discovered that the wound on Stephen's hand is not from a snake bite. It's a self-inflicted injury. I found the knife he used to harm himself, and I have the evidence. The crowd erupted in gasps, and all eyes turned to Stephen, wide with shock. Rose stepped forward, standing beside Mateo and nodding in agreement. Mateo is right. I believe him. Samuel never let his snakes harm anyone, and this was all a scheme to tarnish his reputation. Stephen laughed loudly, though the tension in his voice was evident. Mateo, what nonsense are you spouting? Do you have proof? I was bitten by a snake, and the whole village knows it. Mateo didn't waver. He pulled a small knife from his pocket, holding it up for everyone to see. This is the knife I found in Stephen's pocket. The blood on it matches the wound on his hand. He injured himself to deceive us. Stephen's face paled, but he tried to maintain his composure. How do I know you didn't plant that knife on me, Mateo? Who's going to believe a hunter like you? Mateo smirked faintly, pointing to the wound on Stephen's hand. If you were bitten by a snake, why are there no clear bite marks? I've hunted all my life, and I know the signs of a wild animal's attack. This isn't a snake bite. It's a scratch made by a blade. The villagers began murmuring among themselves, many turning skeptical eyes toward Stephen. Nathan, who had once been swayed by Stephen, stepped forward, his expression uncertain. Stephen, do you have anything to say? Stephen stepped back, sweat beading on his forehead. They're setting me up. This is all lies. Mateo didn't let him escape. He turned to the crowd, his voice ringing out like a bell in the growing silence. I'm not asking you to believe me blindly. Look at the facts. Remember what Samuel did for this village. He lived peacefully and never harmed anyone. We can't let a liar like Stephen destroy his legacy. A few villagers nodded in agreement. Rose added, her voice filled with emotion, Samuel was part of this village. He didn't just protect those snakes, he was a symbol of patience and love. We can't let Stephen tarnish his name. The villagers, moved by Mateo and Rose's words, began discussing passionately. The square suddenly felt like a courtroom, with voices of dissent clashing. Don Rafael, the elderly man, stepped forward, raising his hand for silence. We must think carefully, he said, his voice calm but authoritative. Samuel lived in this village his entire life and never harmed anyone. His snakes never attacked anyone either. So why are we so quick to believe the accusations of Stephen, who has only been here for a few years? A young woman, Isabel, nodded in agreement. Exactly. If Samuel was truly dangerous, why hasn't anyone been harmed by his snakes all these years? I think we've been too quick to trust Stephen without examining the facts. Stephen, standing off to the side, looked increasingly tense. He scanned the crowd, searching for support, but was met mostly with skeptical glances. Nathan, who had once been his ally, now turned to question him. Nathan, Stephen said, his voice low but firm, if you were truly bitten by a snake, why doesn't your wound show any fang marks? Explain that to us clearly. Stephen swallowed hard, his eyes darting around nervously. I don't know. Maybe it's some kind of special snake that doesn't leave fang marks. Mateo chuckled, but his laughter was filled with disdain. That's the best excuse you can come up with? Stephen, the truth is you injured yourself to frame Samuel and sow division among the villagers. But you miscalculated. We're not fools. Rose stepped forward, her voice stronger than ever. Stephen, if you have nothing to hide, let us take you to the town doctor. If they confirm that your wound is a snake bite, we'll believe you. But if it isn't, you must admit your guilt. The crowd murmured, the whispers growing louder. Some began nodding in agreement with Rose's suggestion. Stephen, realizing he was cornered, tried to protest. I don't have to prove anything. I was injured, and that's the truth. Then why are you afraid? Don Raphael asked, his sharp gaze fixed on Stephen. If you're not lying, let us verify your claim. Only the guilty fear the truth. Stephen took a step back, sweat dripping from his forehead. He knew the tide was turning against him. The villagers, divided moments ago, were now beginning to unite. Rose and Mateo had sparked doubt in Stephen and rekindled respect for Samuel. Stop! Stephen shouted, his voice trembling. Fine. I admit it. The square fell silent. All eyes turned to Stephen, who no longer carried the confidence or arrogance he had before. He hung his head, his voice barely audible. I lied. I wasn't bitten by a snake. I hurt myself. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. Nathan, unable to contain his anger, stepped forward. You lied to all of us, Stephen. You not only slandered Samuel but also tore apart the unity of this village. Stephen, seeing no way out, decided to confess the full truth. I just wanted the snakes. They're so valuable. I thought if Samuel was driven out by the villagers, I could take over his farm and sell the snakes for profit. Rose shook her head, her voice filled with contempt. Not only are you greedy, but you're also heartless. Samuel died protecting those snakes he considered family. And all because of your selfishness. Mateo added, his tone like a judge delivering a sentence. It doesn't stop at slander. Stephen, you set fire to Samuel's farm. You caused the death of an innocent man. Stephen panicked, stammering a denial. No, it wasn't me. You have no proof. Mateo pulled a charred piece of fabric from his pocket. Here's the proof. I found this near the burned snake enclosures. This fabric matches the shirt you were wearing that night, Stephen. You can't deny it. The villagers erupted in anger. Stephen's lies had been exposed, and now he had to face the consequences. Nathan, once manipulated by Stephen, stepped forward and declared, Stephen, you destroyed the peace of this village and tarnished Samuel's honor. We won't forgive you. Don Raphael spoke up, his voice stern and authoritative. Stephen, you must take responsibility for your actions. We will report this to the authorities and let them decide your punishment. The villagers quickly agreed on a course of action. Rose and Mateo led a group to take the evidence to the police in the nearby town. Stephen was securely tied up, leaving him no chance to escape. His face was pale and defeated as he was paraded through the square. The villagers' gazes were filled with contempt and anger. You've destroyed the peace of this village, but we'll make sure justice is served, Mateo said firmly. Nathan walked beside him, his eyes filled with resolve. I was deceived by you once, but now I won't let you hurt anyone else. Samuel didn't deserve what happened to him. When they reached the police station, Rose stepped forward and presented all the evidence they had gathered to the police chief. The accounts from the villagers, the charred fabric, and the bloodied knife were all laid out clearly. The police chief, a seasoned and stern man, listened attentively. "This evidence is compelling," he said, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Stephen, who hung his head in silence. "Your actions were not only a crime against an innocent man but a threat to the entire community. You will pay for this." Within hours, Stephen was formally charged with arson, slander, and exploiting the trust of the villagers. He was taken into custody and led to a cell. The cold iron bars slammed shut behind him, marking the end of his schemes and lies. News of Stephen's arrest quickly spread throughout the village. A sense of relief washed over the community. The villagers gathered in the square to thank Mateo and Rose for their bravery. Nathan, who had been influenced by Stephen, bowed his head and apologized to Rose. "I was wrong not to believe in Samuel. I hope everyone can forgive me." As the incident came to a close, the villagers reflected on their mistakes in letting Stephen manipulate them. A sense of regret settled over the small village. Those who had sided with Stephen now sat together, recalling memories of Samuel, a quiet man with a deep love for his snakes and the memory of his late wife. They realized that he had lived a life of kindness and dedication, misunderstood by many. To atone for their actions, the villagers decided to hold a ceremony in Samuel's honor. The village square was adorned with lanterns and wildflowers gathered from the surrounding hills. Don Rafael, with his deep, steady voice, opened the ceremony. Samuel was part of this village. He wasn't the danger we once believed but a friend to silent souls, living in harmony with nature. After the ceremony, the villagers built a small monument near Samuel's burned-down farm. Made of stone, it depicted a snake coiled around an olive branch, a symbol of peace. The inscription read, "Samuel, friend to silent souls." The surviving snakes were taken by Rose and Mateo to a nearby forest, where they could live freely, as Samuel would have wanted. As they released the snakes into the wild, Mateo bowed his head and whispered, "Live free, as he sacrificed himself to protect you." The village's atmosphere grew calmer. Through Samuel's story, the villagers learned a lesson about respect and compassion for what is different. His monument became a place of reflection, a reminder that kindness and love always triumph over greed and deceit. Samuel's story teaches us profound lessons about compassion, appreciation, and responsibility toward nature. Though misunderstood and isolated, he lived true to his values, protecting what he cherished. Stephen's greed and lies caused loss and pain, reminding us that selfishness always leads to consequences. By respecting differences and living sincerely, we build trust and unity in our communities.
If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep bringing heartwarming stories almost every day. We are very grateful for your support. See you soon.